Welcome to Case by Case. This is a podcast brought to you by Luke and Calum Chain. We're here in person today. Calum, how are you?
I'm very good, Luke. Very good. Very happy to be here.
Good. Yeah, and I'm excited today. We're in a studio.
We're in a London podcasting studio.
Yeah, this is cool. Too many cameras for my liking, but
and I'm not sure how many people in suits they've seen come through their doors. I think usually the podcasts are perhaps of a slightly more modern angle than ours.
I think that's fair to say. I'll confess, I got a few looks as I walked through the foyer here in Hoxton. Now, more exciting than all of that, we've got a guest on today. We have Jim Leighton from the North of England P&I Club. Welcome, Jim. Can you hear us?
Yes, I certainly can. Thanks, Luke and Calum, for inviting me.
Great. Yeah. Look, well, welcome to the podcast. We're really looking forward to getting into the case today with you. But just before we do, I thought I'd say a few words. Jim's a consultant at the North of England P&I Club. He's been at the North since 2013, I think, focused primarily on FD&D. Was telling us earlier that enjoys getting involved in drafting arbitral submissions and all of that fun stuff. And Jim's got quite an interest in maritime law and its development, and been delighted by the amount of contact we've had with Jim over cases related to the podcast and feedback and what have you. So to actually get you on board and to be able to listen to some of your insights on a case is great. We're really pleased to have you on.
Thank you very much.
If you don't mind me saying, Jim, you always have an interesting point on the cases that we're doing. Some interesting reference to a previous case or arbitration award. You seem to have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of the maritime law that comes out. So I'm very interested to chat through this one with you.
Yeah, we've got a good one. We've got a good one today. There's quite a few issues in this. It's an arbitration decision. So as we've had previously when dealing with some of the maritime arbitration cases, it's anonymous, so we don't know the parties involved or the arbitrators or what have you, but we've got quite a detailed case note here. This is London Arbitration 29 of 2022, and it covers some good territory where we're going to touch on charter party issues, particularly speed and performance claims, hull fouling, redelivery issues. We've got the bimco piracy clause to touch on as well, and there's a tug assistance aspect to it at the end. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of those issues today, but let's see how we go. Yeah,
it's one of those cases where there was basically a balance of account at the end of the charter period, and each side said that they were entitled to one. Either they were entitled to some money back or they weren't, and then you have to go through as ever the statement of account or the final hire statement and work out where the differences have arisen. And it seems that in this one, a large part of it was the speed and performance claim.
I dare say, Jim, you've come across a few speed and performance claims in your time.
I certainly have, and this one's an interesting one. It probably represents quite a typical example of these sorts of disputes. It's obviously got a few twists and turns in there.
Yeah, it's interesting, that point, because we don't know who the arbitrators were on this decision, but it was a 3-person tribunal for a relatively small claim. Reading completely between the lines, this wasn't expressed in it, although there were some comments at the end about the speed and performance claims and how they shaped up. But it came through to me that the arbitrators had quite a strong view about things, and in the way that they handled the issues quite decisively, I thought were seemingly very experienced and knew their way around this stuff.
Yeah, no, you got the sense that they actually did quite a dim view of the speed and performance claims once they'd gone through them in detail. And it's interesting, Jim, to hear you say that perhaps you don't always see the rigorous analysis applied as to the whether or not the weather bureaus have properly inputted the warranties in the charter. Because that's certainly something that you always look to do when you're bringing a speeding consumption claim or defending a speeding consumption claim. You need to make sure that the evidence you're relying on properly mirrors the charter party provisions.
Yeah, I mean it's certainly my experience, and quite often with the types of claims that we're dealing with, we can be dealing with quite complex speed and consumption claims in a small claims type of context, which obviously makes it slightly more challenging. Whereas I think in this case, because it was a full arbitration and there was more involved, I think the arbitrators have perhaps deep dived a little further to really try to bottom things out in a pretty useful way here.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think that's right in my experience. Often the time that's needed to properly assess these speed and performance claims is not proportionate to the sums involved. So it does take well-experienced practitioners, I think, to be able to size these up relatively quickly. And even then, you've got to still look through the detail of them. So I think the starting point for any of these types of claims is the charter party and the clauses. And we've got two clauses to kind of look at here, Clause 29 and Clause 88 of the charter party, and how the two of them work independently and how they work together, and how they sit with each other, I suppose. And that was one of the first issues the tribunal got into.
Yeah, exactly. And this was one where they had taken away the NYP wording. It was an amended NYP form. They'd taken away the NYP wording and replaced it with their own clauses. Clause 29, which said that speed and consumption was based on good weather conditions. Then it defined the good weather conditions as up to Beaufort Scale 4 and Douglas Sea State 3, with no adverse current and no adverse influence of swell. And then you had your normal kind of ballast and laden speeds. And again, you had an eco speed warranty in good weather, various different speeds. This was actually quite a comprehensive speed and consumption clause. It did give a number of different speeds between about 14 and 11 knots, and it gave the corresponding consumption for each of those speeds. And then you get down to Clause 88. Clause 88 kind of spoke about the Independent Weather Bureau. And it said that charterers can supply Independent Weather Bureau advice from a reputable Independent Weather Bureau as selected by charterers, except WNI and ocean routes, to the master during voyages specified by the charterers. It then went on the masters to comply with the reporting procedures of the routing service selected by charterers. If during the currency of the charter party, the speed of the vessel be reduced and or fuel consumption be increased after production to owners of a documented claim supported by the Weather Bureau, charterers shall have the right to deduct from hire an amount equivalent to the time lost and or cost of any extra fuel consumed. It then said that those deductions had to be agreed before they were actually reduced. And finally, in the event of a consistent discrepancy between deck log and weather routing service, and in the absence of amicable settlement, the matter to be referred to arbitration. And that was kind of the way in here, because you have these discrepancies about what is good weather and what's not good weather.
You certainly do. It's an interesting clause. It obviously opens things up to being able to get a weather bureau involved. It doesn't really substantively change anything from the speed and consumption warranty itself, but it obviously does open it up to make it a continuing warranty. So rather than just purely on at the time of contracting or on delivery, it goes on throughout, which is obviously what led us to the four different claims that were involved during the charter period.
I was going to flag that because sometimes you see very overtly that this is the warranty is to continue. I didn't see that wording, at least in the report, but it does, the effect of Clause 88 has to be that it's a continuing warranty, because there's this continuing right to make a deduction from hire. Yeah,
but there was still then this question as to whether Clause 88, with the weather reports coming in, amended the warranty in any way. And that was really the first issue that the tribunal looked at, and the tribunal decided that it doesn't. The warranty stands on its own. It doesn't it doesn't modify or qualify or mitigate or ameliorate the terms of the warranty, but it does, allow, or kind of the core function, if you like, of Clause 88 is to allow an evidential basis to come in and have a discussion using weather reports. And if there's a discrepancy, then there can be a debate about it, rather it just being kind of black and white. Yeah, so from there, the tribunal then went on to go through four different parts of the voyage, or four different voyages. The first of those was the Albany to Ghent leg. And what was interesting about this was that instructions were given by the charterers to the master to slow steam, and expressly set out in the instructions that they understand that this will mean that the vessel can't maintain warranted speed. And, with that opening in the section, I'm like, where's the claim going to come from here? And then not too long after it, you could see they must have been kind of playing things at the other end of the voyage as to when the vessel is going to get there and when it's going to be allowed into berth. And then it's given instructions to hurry up. And so it has 10 days of sailing fast to get there. And then there was this debate about, whether I think it met the warranty in that one, but overconsumed on bunkers. And then, they wanted to claim the extra cost in bunkers.
You not infrequently see eco speeds being without guarantee and speed and performance warranties. I've seen that in some charters. I don't think it was the case here, but you do sometimes see, as a matter of practice, that the performance speed is warranted and the eco speeds are all given without guarantee. On this one, obviously, as you say, there was a kind of acknowledgement that they weren't going to be able to be held to the speed and performance warranties, but later they decided they wanted them to be. And that amounted to around 22,500 from hire.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was slightly interesting that they thought it was going to be without warranty. I mean, based on the information that we've got, it doesn't say that it's without warranty or guarantee. But even if it does expressly say it, I've quite often see people try to sweep it aside and claim anyway. But
yeah.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on the wording and the context.
Yeah, it's interesting when you see these without guarantee warranties. Obviously, they're not really warranties, but then what is the intention of those provisions? And one area where we've seen them before is if you have a provision that says that the vessel has to be delivered with a clean hull on delivery, and it's not, and as a result, it doesn't perform at the warranted level. And I've never seen this tested, but I think it probably is right. The breach there is not the breach of the speed and performance warranties or even the without guarantee warranties. The breach there is the fact that you're delivering in breach of the agreement with an unclean hull.
Yeah, it's usually line 21, 22.
Exactly.
And NYP 46. And then you've also got the potential with the general off-hire clause of it being caught if the nature of their fouling is enough to drag down the performance of the vessel below what would otherwise be expected.
Exactly. And exactly as you say, you're not then looking at whether there's been a breach of the speed and performance warranty because you've already have your breach. So you're looking at finding the measure of damages against which that should be assessed. So sometimes if you have a without guarantee wording, then you can say, well, we don't use that as a warranty. We don't claim against that as a warranty, but we do use that to assess our breach where there's been a delivery with an unclean hull, for example. The ship should have been capable of doing what was, what owners communicated that it could do, even if in fact, we're not claiming for a breach of that particular warranty.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the issue of what is the loss caused by the breach, it can quite get into murky waters if you're in a position where you broadly know what the vessel ought to be doing, you've got something else, but how do you quite assess what the difference is, bearing in mind the nature of the maritime environment? It's not like driving down a road. It's more like off-roading, and you don't quite know what weather and currents and other conditions might hit you. And
then, so coming on to the second voyage for a grand total of $2,105 from Ghent to Ventspils. There, the bureau, the Weather Bureau, in its report, we don't know the names of the bureaus here, assessed the vessel's performance in near good weather, but made no allowance for the word about in the warranty. And I think that this kind of counted against the charterer's whole approach and its reliance on the weather reports, not just in respect to this particular voyage, but the inconsistency in the way that the bureaus dealt with assessing, or the criteria for assessing the different periods of overconsumption. That inconsistency was a real problem for them, and I think it didn't help them on the overall picture of trying to prefer the weather reports over what the ship's logs and the ship's slip was showing.
And this is exactly what you said at the start, Jim, and I think it hits the nail on the head about why this speed and performance claim had so many difficulties. And it's because there was a lack of credibility from these weather reports. When you see things like the misapplication of about, it's very hard then to say, well, these guys have otherwise, apart from that, the weather reporters have got it perfect. When you start to see a few mistakes coming into these kind of reports, then you need to really iron those out before you put them before a tribunal.
Certainly with what we see at the club, quite often people present the reports and it's obvious that the report provider has kind of done their own thing through through the process. And then there's this gradual back and forth in the correspondence of pointing out all of the things that they've done or they haven't explained that don't quite match up with what's in the charter, to try to refine things to figure out, whether there is actually a basis for a claim.
And really, I think we see similar points taken again in the third voyage and the fourth voyage as well. Again, both claiming for over consumption. I think there's another point to be made here about how these claims are generally handled. And of course, you'll have seen many of these, Jim, where the reports are provided, there's some back and forth. A lot of it's horse traded out and, settled, finalised and get on with things. It's rare, it does happen, as we all know, but it's rare to go this far over these types of sums of money. And in the back and forth, whether it's being handled by someone like Jim at a club, or if it does get to us at external firms, then we find a way to kind of resolve them. And when you look at cases like this, I think it's useful to always reflect upon them to then know where are the pressure points in a future negotiation. I think that's a really good example of where the weather report didn't focus on the word about, ignored it. And it's an easy way to chip away at it, right, if you're on the owner's side here.
And there's then a reference in this kind of conclusion of this speed and performance section to London Arbitration 2321. You've mentioned, Jim, that you're aware of that case as well. Can we put you on the spot to talk to us a little bit about that one?
You certainly can. Essentially, it held that DSS, it was invented in the 1920s. It's based on a description rather than a quantitative terminology. It provides approximate wave heights. I think those were only added in around about 1938. So it deals with a total sea comprising a wind-driven sea waves and swell from a distant storm. In this case, the particular part of the warranty with DSS3 maximum 1.25 meters and no swell. So the finding effectively limited the wave height to 1.25 meters. Despite the arbitrator saying that in his view, based on his own feedback, it probably equated to about 1.5 meters. But obviously the parties are being slightly clearer here, which ordinarily they're not. I mean, if you have something like significant wave height instead, which is what the report provider was trying to apply, you do actually have something slightly more quantitative. It's the average height of the highest 1/3 of all waves, but ultimately, the point that was driven at in 2321 was that you can't really equate significant wave height to DSS3. So you kind of have to try to apply the wording that you've got, and take things from there.
And it's not always easy to work out what the Douglas Sea state is. That's kind of what I took away from these arbitration awards, and that wasn't something that I'd quite appreciated. Prior to particularly London Arbitration 2321, it's not a quantitative metric, as you say. And it's interesting to hear you say significant wave height might be a better one. I mean, is that something you would encourage people to put into their charter parties for better contractual certainty? Or
I think from a point of view that it's quantitative, or to the extent that you want to make reference to DSS3, you're actually better off giving a maximum and explaining, are we just talking about the wind waves? Are we talking about swell waves as well, or one or the other? Quite often there's quite a lot of confusion that's caused. Whereas if you have something like significant wave height, at least you have from like the International Weather Organization, there are proper guidelines as to how measurements are supposed to be taken to try to figure that out from the bridge of the vessel. And I think one of the other points that was made is that the report providers here have actually relied on satellite observations from HICOM. But I think this is one of the points that Luke was trying to drive towards, the fact that there was quite a strong view that, reading between the lines, the technology isn't quite there to be able to say, the master or the chief officer, whoever's on watch, hasn't quite observed correctly yet. And I think that was sort of leading on to the next point. The fact technology is not quite there, so the preference is probably to rely on what the vessel's saying to the extent that it's obviously credible.
Actually, going back to the clause, I've seen this clause said if there's a discrepancy between the Weather Bureau and the deck logs, then it goes to arbitration.
Yeah,
which is good if you're a lawyer, or good if you're in arbitration. But what I've seen a lot in these clauses is if there's a discrepancy between the Weather Routing Bureau and the deck logs prevail.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a more normal position.
And I think it's also the natural inclination of arbitrators too, is that they'll prefer the evidence of those on board the ship unless there is reason to doubt it. Yeah. And sometimes there is.
You see that with weather and statement of facts as well. If there's a demurrage dispute because of bad weather, then the statement of facts, if signed, is very good evidence of what the weather actually was, even if you could have historical weather reports that show differently.
Yeah, it's interesting that point you make, Jim, about the data. I do think eventually we're going to get to the point where the technology and the data is pretty persuasive. I'm not sure we're there yet, as you say, and I agree. But I suspect we will get there at some point. It's the more that we have this tech on board ships, internet improves on ships, and all the rest of it. So ultimately, the charter has failed.
If you're going to a tribunal with weather reports that are different to the deck logs, and the weather reports themselves have some inaccuracies, then you're on a hiding to nothing, really. I like the description at the end. The charter's incongruous performance claims. So moving on to redelivery, I think that was the next topic. And as always, we're kind of running over on our time as usual. In studios, we've actually got to think about how much time we're spending on these things, aren't we? normally at home I have all day, but
we have to top it up, top up the meter. So yeah, the redelivery issues. So this was about whether the vessel, or whether the charterers could redeliver the ship in a state that wasn't as per charter party. Pretty well-known principle that is possible, and that the vessel does not have to be in a sound condition to redeliver her, but that the charterers may be liable in damages for breach of the obligation to redeliver in sound condition. And that's what happened here in this section, where the owners were liable in damages. The charterers were liable in damages, but that the charterers could redeliver. And the important point here is that by redelivering, you stop hire. Now, interestingly, the time that's then spent cleaning the hull and getting it back to the condition that it should have been delivered in, the time element of it is assessed at charter rate anyway. So, in a way, they still get a good component of that at higher rate. And then there's the additional costs, the additional cleaning costs as well. I think it was a hull fouling issue, wasn't it? More than 20 days.
Exactly. But do you think that's always going to be at the charter rate? I mean, if you had a situation where there was a follow-on charter and the market had moved significantly, and it's conceivable that the breach could have been sufficient to cost owners significant damages under a follow-on charter, and this doesn't seem to be something that was really argued in this case. But that, to me, seems like it could be a direct loss that follows from the breach. The breach being redelivering in the wrong condition. Yeah,
and we've had cases like this where you're looking at redelivery, and the debate is actually about whether you're going to apply the higher rate or the market rate. And that can swing drastically. If it's been a long-term time charter and you're coming to the end of it, the market could be completely different to where it was during the charter.
I think normally for late redelivery, you have the charter party rate. If it's a straightforward late redelivery, then normally the charter party rate would continue to apply. I mean, there are arguments around it. There is in the context of late redelivery, there was a suggestion in I think the Court of Appeal case in the Gregos, which was the kind of the House of Lords case on this, where they suggested it was all obiter, but there was a suggestion that if there was a situation where the owner had said to the charterer, "I'm going to suffer this loss of this new fixture if you redeliver late," then it could be that there was a separate agreement entered into between the charterer and the owner on a quantum merit basis following the originally scheduled redelivery that could then mean that you bypass the normal rules of of remoteness to get into the high market rate that you lost. That seems, I mean, it's quite a tricky argument to run, particularly in this case, but I don't think it's entirely settled that if you have a redelivery in an unclean condition, that you're fixed to the charge party rate. I think there are some arguments that you can come up with that get you around that if there's more damages for an owner.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is it is going to depend. I mean, the one thing that I found interesting about this is, like you said, that they have awarded the higher rate for the time, but then they've awarded the market rate for the additional fuel that's used. So there's a slight disparity there, and it's quite what the rationale is, because I think the Y crag was a decision that says, once redelivery has taken place, you're then off the higher rate for obvious reasons that potentially it could be very unreasonable under certain circumstances with the vessel remaining on hire. But then it becomes an issue of, well, is it actually the higher rate that you were paying that you've lost? Is it perhaps the ability to have fixed into the market sooner, or is it actually caused a detention before you can get the vessel into the next fixture, where you would obviously, either possibly a higher or a lower rate, and you've been held out of, you've obviously been held out of that. And one of the things that I think was a bit of a question mark over this one was quite, where was the vessel going next? Because the tribunal point out that, she was, after she's dropped the guards in, Fujairah, and then gone to, Corfarcan for the cleaning of the hull, she's then, gone off elsewhere to be delivered into the next fixture. And it sort of raises the issue of, well, was the vessel going to go to the UAE or in that direction anyway before redelivery? Because it's obviously a fair part of the quantum, the fact that it's DLSOP in Pakistan for the redelivery, and then the vessel steams across over to the UAE. And the thing is she going to the Persian, the Arabian Gulf for her next fixture? Perhaps she was going further down towards South Africa. It may have been that part of the steaming that was done would have been done anyway. But they don't seem to have really sort of separated out that aspect. I mean, everything else is relatively straightforward. Things like with the cleaning itself, obviously it takes a certain amount of time. You incur the costs for that. So there is a detention, the vessel, additional expense to clean. But then there's a sort of wider consideration, what the actual measure of loss. Are we potentially overcompensating depending on what the vessel was scheduled to do next?
And then the next head, and this is I think a pretty short one, but there was a claim in respect of short bunkers on redelivery. And it was pretty clear that the vessel was redelivered without the same amount of bunkers on board as it was delivered. There was an obligation to deliver back with the same bunkers as on delivery. And the debate here was whether the charter should have the benefit of a tolerance, even though the charter party did not provide for the word about in terms of the quantity. They said they should get a 5% tolerance. Tribunal found against them on that and said, look, there's no tolerance. It is what it is. You've got to compensate for the difference of whatever the charter party rate versus market rate is on the cost of those additional bunkers. So I don't think there's much to say on that. Did you have? I
think that covers it. I think we're pushing for time. So let's move on to the armed guards.
Yes, the armed guards. Do you want to take that one, Calum?
Yeah. So this CP had the BIMco piracy clause, and the owners made the argument that the armed guards were a measure that was being used to minimize risk, and therefore they fall into this BIMco piracy clause. And they said that time up to the disembarkation of the armed guards at Fujairah was a result of the measure of putting the armed guards on board, and therefore charters were liable for the time and costs up until that departure. And the charterers, however, said essentially that the guards needed to be disembarked at Fujairah because the owners had agreed to take them there as part of their own security contract with the armed guards. But I think that Charter's argument was essentially you didn't need to take the armed guards all the way to Fujairah to disembark them. You could have disembarked them sooner. And therefore we are not liable as charterers for the entirety, because there has to be some causative relationship between the costs that we're paying and the kind of heightened risk to the vessel and cargo and crew. And they said there was no heightened risk beyond the point at which you could have discharged the armed guards or disembarked the armed guards. But instead, you chose to disembark them at Fujairah because of your contract with the security team, and therefore we're not liable for the entirety of these costs.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have a certain amount of sympathy with the charterers on this, because there's always the practical issue of when and where you can put armed guards back ashore, because in some countries you simply can't. And the wording in the clause itself, I think it's subclause D. I, and it's any time lost taking measures to minimize risk. And obviously it wasn't minimizing the risk itself. I think it's certainly one that's debatable. But, it's the one thing that jumps off the page out of the issues that are addressed where you're sort of, is that quite right?
On the one hand, if you're owners, then you say, well, these were the terms that we agreed. We had to agree the whole contract with the security personnel in order to minimize the risk. But equally, from the charter's perspective, I can totally see the argument where they say, why are we paying all of these costs? Do we need, are we still minimizing a risk here, or are we doing something else?
Yeah, because it's time lost, right? Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Any comments on the whole fouling section?
Yeah, I mean, it's relatively straightforward and conventional in terms of the it's very common wording that you see with these types of things. I mean, it was, I suppose, part of the thing, evidentially, the fact that the owners were able to provide some good evidence to show out, actually the hull was in good condition before we delivered this in. It then sort of begs the question, well, if it was in good condition when it was chartered, when it was initially delivered into the service, it's only up to 7 months of service. Most of the stays have been relatively short, but the last one at Bin Qasim hits the 22 days. So you're 2 days over the requirements. It's then an issue of the usual practicality of there's an obligation to have a look to see whether there's fouling. If there is, then there's the obligation to clean. But here, for some reason, it seems that it hasn't been dealt with at Bin Qasim. Possibly for a number of reasons, and the UAE is often quite a good place to be able to deal with these types of things. You can kind of understand why there's been the perception that, well, question mark, has there been the fouling? Well, when you get to the UAE and you inspect, you find that there is the fouling. It's then a question of what the reasonable costs are in terms of what you can recover for the work that's been done to remove the fouling. And again, sort of tying back into the whole costs of going from Bin Qasim over to the UAE, it sort of ties in neatly with the issue under the BIMCO clause of whether or not dropping the armed guards off in the UAE is covered. And the same issue arises here. It's just like, well, fair dues, the vessel has to steam somewhere. The vessel has been redelivered. It's probably at the charter rate. Yeah, but has there actually been a loss? Where was the vessel going next? And particularly one of the things we don't know on the facts whether the vessel took bunkers, but quite often Fujairah is quite a key area that a vessel would go to take on bunkers anyway before the next the next fixture. So again, I think that some of the facts that are missing from what's discussed kind of dovetails in on those two issues.
Yeah, it suggests there's some operational convenience to owners to going to Fujairah beyond simply the beyond simply the need to clean or whatever else it was they were doing.
And look, on the next head was a damage claim. I think this one can be dealt with relatively quickly. This is a damage to vessel claim. It was found that the charterers during loading and or discharging did damage the vessel, some of the holds. But the problem here was that the owners didn't produce an invoice to substantiate their loss. So the tribunal found that, yes, the owners would have been able to make a claim, Had they repaired the damage within a reasonable time after conclusion of the charter party, and had they produced an invoice, then they could have made out the claim, but they didn't produce an invoice. And so it actually just turned on an evidential basis where they weren't able to prove their loss. So that one got tossed. And then the last topic is the Mississippi River tug assistance claim.
As I guess a lot of people know, in the Mississippi River, there's some kind of currents that can pull the vessel one way or another, and the terminal on this occasion suspended loading because the vessel was kind of moving away from the berth, and they said to the master, "You need to bring a tug in before we can resume cargo operations." So they brought in a tug, and the charterers deducted the costs of the tug from hire, and at that point, the master witnessed other vessels also needing tug assistance along the berth, and the charterers had provided no evidence to show that the crew failed to attend to the mooring lines or disregarded their other terminal protocols, or in any other way had failed to maintain the sensible mooring protocols or an adequate mooring watch. So the tribunal held that the requirement of the terminal to have a tug was to do with the berth's location. As I said a second ago, quite well known that in the Mississippi River you can have these tides and these currents, and that was an issue for charterers to deal with because it was a kind of peculiarity of the specific terminal to which charterers had ordered the vessel. So it was a charterer's risk rather than a owner's risk, because all of the mooring had been done sensibly. So the risk fell on charterers, I guess, as you would expect.
Yeah, it's something that we see time and again at the club. I mean, obviously the general position is under the voyage charter, unless there's express words to the contrary, it's usually the owner's expense. And then under a time charter, unless the crew have done something wrong or it's an off-hire event, then usually it's the charterer's expense because it's part and parcel of performing the voyage. But you do once in a while see these get quite contentious because the costs of the tugboats, depending on how long they're there, can get quite high. And like the value of this dispute, I've seen disputes just on this type of issue where you're talking about $250,000 in tugs fee.
Oh yeah,
tug fees. Yeah, under pretty poor conditions in the river, and then one party gets stung with a bill, and then
certain times of year, after the ice starts to melt and the river flows and it's up, there are lots of issues.
Indeed, and the thing is, because the river's nice and deep when all the ice water is flowing in, it tends to mean that you can load more cargo. But obviously, the more cargo you get on board, the more the sort of high the effect on the hull. So the harder the tugs have to push to try to keep you aside. So it often seems quite precarious from a point of view of the master having to try to manage this to keep the vessel safe, but equally to try to load within the instructions. Bear in mind it's a busy river, and things can become pretty problematic if the vessel does come off the berth.
Do you think there's any, you make the distinction between the voyage charter and the time charter, and obviously in the voyage charter, owners have kind of assumed some degree of the risk over the port that the vessel's going to. And I wonder about this, and I also wonder about this in the context of implied indemnities, whether a trip time charter that has very clear loading and discharge ports shifts that burden slightly back towards owners for issues arising at one of those named ports. Maybe a podcast for another day, that one.
I think it is. That is an interesting one. So, and answer off the top of the head, who knows?
Let's do that. Let's park that one for next time. Well, look, the owners overall were pretty much successful. They got $180,000 of their 220 claim, and got costs to boot. Yeah. Jim, thank you very much for joining us. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. We got to cover quite a bit in all that. So, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy hearing your insights. And you're welcome back anytime, my friend.
That's great. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Calum. Until next time.
I really enjoyed it. Take care. Goodbye.
See you. Bye. Bye.